So, this is a topic obviously dear to my heart as a therapist. Currently involved in a case involving a former cult member who is suing her cult for all the the hundreds of thousands of dollars she quote unquote donated to them. And there is a psychologist on the other side in this case, and I how can I put this? I advised the attorney who hired me to challenge the other psychologist because she's testifying about whether or not this individual is was quote unquote brainwashed in her cult, and she's got no cult experience, none. So one of the things I when I was deposed, one of the issues that came up was the psychiatrist says, "Oh, if she's so, if this person is in so much pain, how come she's not in therapy? How come she only went to therapy a few times?" I said, "Well, that's actually covered pretty well in 2 book chapters that I wrote. Maybe you should read something about how to do therapy with people who've been involved with cults." At any rate, the topic. This is a topic dear to my heart because of the dozens and dozens and dozens of reports I've heard from people who've been involved in cultic groups who go to therapy with the best of intentions. And in the worst case scenario, and this does happen, they wind up with a therapist who is also involved in a cult and doesn't know it, usually a psychotherapy form of cult. So that's the worst case scenario, but most of the time, therapists really don't know very much at all about cults. That's changing, thank goodness, for a variety of reasons, one of which being the expansion of the understanding of cultic dynamics to include IPV, what used to be called DV, intimate partner violence, and abusive controlling and coercive relationships. Most psychologists are at least somewhat familiar with that, so that's a sign of progress. At any rate, the goal of my presentation here is to talk about what science informs us about what makes a good therapist, keeping in mind that good therapists make mistakes, and we need to be aware of that. What to do if you have questions about what your therapist is doing, what to do if your therapist is not cult aware and knowledgeable, which is of course the majority, and what to do if your therapist is quote unquote bad, incompetent, and or even harmful. So one of the things in any talk I give, I like to just cover this for reasons that are probably obvious to most of you. And that is to talk about the difference between opinion or value judgments and objectivity. So value judgments imply how a person ought to behave. Objective statements describe how people actually behave. Value judgments cannot be empirically evaluated. Objective statements can be empirically evaluated. So I always like to try to keep that in mind. So factors involved in good effective therapy. It's the relationship. Okay. There used to be a website by 2 prominent psychologists literally called "It's the Relationship, Stupid." I think that's a little derogatory, but you can understand maybe where the cultural artifact of that comes from. But it is the relationship, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then talk about what can be problematic. So the key elements of a therapeutic relationship, and keep in mind, we're now talking about 80 years of research. Okay, so it started around the 1950s is when we started to do research on what's effective in psychotherapy. And so we're approaching 80 years of research, thousands and thousands of studies. So I consider this to be pretty solid. So unconditional acceptance, the ability to accept the person where they are at, very, very, very important. Empathy, that seems almost obvious. Genuineness, the therapist should be genuine. That doesn't mean that they come in and they've just broken up with their partner and they come in and start crying in front of you. That's not genuine. That's bad therapy. Okay, but genuine in the context of the therapy. Okay, responding to you authentically and genuinely. Attending and listening. Again, that seems kind of obvious, but it always blows me away when I hear somebody say, well, I was talking to my therapist and I noticed that they'd fallen asleep. That does happen. It's happened to me. Let me be honest. I've had moments where I've, just very briefly closed my eyes and, wound up having a 2-second nap. And, that says something about what's going on with me, obviously, not what's going on with the person. So attending and listening. Open-ended questions. And that what we're talking about is questions that don't have a yes or a no answer, but that actually inspire the client or the patient to talk more. And silence, knowing when to STFU. Other factors involved, as I mentioned, a good therapeutic relationship and alliance. That's crucial. What the therapist should be doing at all times is enhancing efficacy and self-esteem. That's really important when when I'm dealing with people who've been involved in cultic groups. That person now, when working with other kinds of patients, if they start telling me, I don't know if I want to, schedule another session, I don't know if I want to come back, but I mean, that might be something that's worth exploring. With people coming out of cultic groups, I'm not saying it's not worth exploring, but ultimately, and I tell people this right off the bat, you are in charge of this relationship. You're in control. That's what's therapeutic in and of itself, okay? Being part of a relationship where you can control what is said, and what you talk about and when you come and how long you stay, really, really important in and of itself. So lowering and raising emotional arousal, okay? Learning how to regulate emotions, not using the coping mechanisms that you've probably learned in your group. What can you do other than praying to surrender to Father, or praying to surrender to whoever or whatever? And again, that's important to do in therapy. It's important to have have a certain level of agitation or upset happen in the session, and then with a therapist, try to work through how can you cope with that arousal in a way that's not cultic. Providing new learning experiences. I love it when former members tell me that I'm full of shit. It's really important. To me, that says you're on your way. Okay, if you can criticize me, that's a really good sign. And it's a learning experience. Again, it's important. One of the most important life experiences that former members can learn, especially those who are born in SGAs and MGAs. It's, being able to challenge authority, and I am, whether I want to admit it or not, I am in the therapeutic context an authority. So challenging authority is a really good learning experience. Activating client expectations, hope, and motivation. Again, that really speaks to the idea that therapy should be client-centered on you, not on the therapist's goals. Do I have goals? If I see somebody, especially early on in treatment, do I have goals for them down the road? Yeah, I do. But they're my goals, and I keep them in mind. Those are my goals, not your goals. My goal, I see somebody who's really bright, really intelligent, really capable of verbalizing how they're thinking and feeling and whatever, and they tell me, I don't want to go to college. That's their right. I may think to myself, oh my goodness, college needs you. But that's my goal. That might be my desire for the client, not theirs. And a good therapist, hopefully, always keeps in mind the difference between, their own agendas and the client's agenda, keeping in mind that you're there to follow the client's agenda, not yours. And then practicing new behaviors, again, being critical, making decisions, engaging in debate when that's, important, things like that. So what are the factors involved in potentially bad, ineffective, or harmful therapy? Some of these are obvious: not listening and responding, judging you. And judging can be, there's an old joke, I don't know how old it is, but anyway, one of the very few therapy jokes I know goes like this. So you have a patient or a client, and when they come early, it means they're anxious. When they come late, it means they're passive aggressive. When they come on time, it means they're obsessive compulsive. Can't win. Can't win. So, I would advise you to avoid therapists who really are into the medical model where everything is a pathology. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you think, I can fit it in somewhere in the DSM. So I personally hate the DSM and always have. I'm old enough that I remember when I came into the field, we were on DSM-2. We're now on DSM-5, and that's not counting the ones that were in between, okay? So actually we're on like DSM-8. But we're on DSM-5 now, and the DSM is a static document, okay? If a friend of mine, I'm thinking of a friend of mine a little bit older than I am, he's 70 years old. When he was 20 years old, he had a manic episode. Right? Never had another one. Never had any other bipolar type symptomology. But according to the DSM, he's still bipolar because he had one manic episode in his life. The DSM is a very static document, and people are dynamic. So when someone says to me, oh, I think my partner is borderline, I'm like, what do you think? I'm like, no, I don't think in those terms. Unless I have to. In forensics, I have to. But in therapy, no. Are there borderline processes? Yes. Do almost everyone at some point in their lives exhibit borderline processes? Probably. Adolescence is inherently borderline. I have a real issue with judging people the more scientific way using the DSM. It's still judgment. Telling you what to do. I think that, again, that should be pretty obvious. And many years ago, I did some training with a therapist named James Framo, and he came out of a more kind of client-centered, kind of radical way of looking at therapy. And one of the things he said to us, and that I always remembered, was if I give a client a quote-unquote homework assignment, and they don't do it, that's not resistance. That's bad timing on my part. Okay, and I think that's really important to think of it that way. If I advise, or usually the terminology I use is I invite. If I invite somebody to try something or do something or think about something, and they come back the next session and they haven't done it, for me to start talking, oh well, you're resistant, that's a form of judgment. Number one. Number two, that's a good way to guarantee that your client's going to start lying to you. And number three, it's just wrong. Okay, I believe very strongly that if I'm inviting my client to think or behave or do anything differently, and they don't do it, it's because my timing was off. So that's my own personal belief, but it's something that I try to inculcate. Back when I was doing a lot of training of new therapists, I tried to inculcate that. So telling you what to do, obviously, in people who've had cultic experiences, that's doing what your group probably, or your person probably told you to do. Imposing religious, spiritual, political, or social beliefs. Okay, I've worked with people who've come out of cults who voted for Trump. That's not that is not why they're there to see me. That's not my concern unless they bring it up. Obviously, I'm telling you a little bit about my own belief system, but I try very hard not to be aware of that and not to push that on my clients. Same thing with religious. I've had. In fact, I'm pretty sure Roberta Eisenberg, Linda Dubrow-Marshall, and I invented the term cult hopping. We wrote an article back in 1982 or 83 where we used that term. People come in and start, they tell me about cult hopping, and I'm not going to criticize the belief system of whatever group that they might be interested in. I'll ask them, I'll invite them to discuss it later. And and if there are certain kinds of admonitions, like don't talk, especially in the large group awareness trainings, they often even make you sign an agreement saying that you're not going to tell anyone anything about what happened. I will tell you unequivocally right now, if you're in any kind of therapeutic system, whatever it may be, whether it's with an individual therapist, whether it's with a group, whether it's with one of these large group trainings, and they tell you not to talk about what's going on, get up and leave. That's a cultic demand, as far as I'm concerned. And there are therapists who, there are therapeutic modalities that did that for a time, and they got heavily criticized over that. And I can talk about that later on, possibly. Not being sensitive to your beliefs or background. Again, that seems fairly obvious. And breaking confidentiality, of course, is not only harmful, it's illegal. I've had, unfortunately, a couple of people that I know, very good therapists, too. One person I'm thinking of in particular, who I'm still very friendly with, and he broke confidentiality, and he was suspended for 5 years, and that was appropriate, and had to go through supervision and training and everything else to get his license back. Yeah. So that's really important. Encouraging you to blame everyone for your issues, all right? I think there's a time and place when it's important for people leaving a group to understand and ascribe a lot of what the pain that they're going through to their involvement in the group. However, and this has been mentioned by other people as well, as a therapist, I also try very hard to keep the person present and future-oriented. Steve Hassan talked about this. It was also talked about in other workshops. I certainly don't avoid talking about the past, but I try very hard to remind my clients that, you know, you have a life now, and you've got decisions to make now, and you've got things to do now, and that's at least as important as going over what happened in the past. And so I'm more concerned about, you know, when you have you come out of a group, you get involved in a relationship, and the chances are good, which is true for everyone, whether you've been in a group or not. I have a my college roommate married and is still married to his high school sweetheart. That's the only one I know. Okay, everyone else I know, myself certainly included, you know, you have more than one relationship. They don't all work out. So you know, I've got a former member in my practice. They have the relationship doesn't go well. Certainly, there's a high likelihood that part of that reason may involve what they experience in their cultic group, but also part of it may involve some just, you know, bad decisions they made in the present. And I'm going to want to try to keep my clients' awareness on both of those factors, not just one of them. I try very hard not to blame everything on the cultic experience. Talking too much about him or herself, well, that's something I struggle with. So yeah, talking about my, you know, and I've been criticized for that. I try very hard, if I talk about things I've experienced, I try very hard to keep that very focused on what the person's bringing up, all right, not related to something that I'm working on. I have my own, as I mentioned to one or two people where this has come up, I've said, no, I've got my own, you know, they'll ask me, well, you know, how's your wife? Because they've read about it or they've heard about it. You know, that's my own, I deal with that in my own therapy. Okay, I'm not, you're here to deal with your stuff, not my stuff. So, you know, I've got my own therapy for that. Pushing you to talk about something you don't want to talk about and aren't ready yet. I still feel terrible about this situation I was in. A person I saw many years ago who was still involved in, I didn't know this right away, that's not why she came for therapy, but she was still involved in a local Philadelphia cultic group that I was very aware of. If any of you know Bryn Athyn, Pennsylvania, you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, that's fine. I'm not going to get into that. But she came in for sex therapy. She was engaged to a man and was, you know, and they both had a belief system that they wanted to be virgins when they were married, and that's fine. Of course, like most people who have that, they were engaging in everything except penetrative vaginal intercourse. So it's not like they weren't, you know, they weren't doing sex, at least by my definition of sex. Anyway, she came in, and the main reason was she had absolutely no attraction to her fiance. And she, about the third or fourth session, she told me that she was involved with this cultic group in Bryn Athyn. Was I aware of it? Yes, I'm aware of it. And she said, please don't tell me I'm a lesbian. And I said, I'm not going to tell you. I couldn't. I mean, that's not for me to decide. Well, about I guess maybe 3 months into the therapy, 2 to 3 months into the therapy, I ask her, I kind of push her a little bit about has she ever, because she initially said, well, maybe I'm asexual. Maybe I'm an asexual person. And I kind of pushed her a little bit, and she finally admitted to me that she did once feel sexual attraction, and it was to a girl in high school. That's the last time I saw her. So I don't know what happened after that. It was just too soon on my part. Rushing a diagnosis or overdiagnosing. The sad joke when I was in community mental health, the sad joke, and it's an offshoot of an older joke, and I'm Jewish, I'm allowed to say this. There's an old joke, you get two Jews together, you get three political opinions. And right. And it's a sad commentary that with a lot of I was primarily involved in children's mental health and community mental health, and we get kids in who'd seen 4 psychiatrists and they have 6 different diagnoses. So I rushing a diagnosis, and unfortunately, those of us who are in the field and take insurance, what does the insurance company tell you to do? After one session, diagnose the person. Yeah, that's right. And especially when we're dealing with cultic situations where there could be PTSD, there could be chronic PTSD, chronic complex PTSD, there can be dissociative disorders, there can be all sexual disorders, all kinds of issues going on. And I remember once hearing a well-known specialist in dissociative identity disorder, used to be called multiple personality disorder, saying that you need to be seeing somebody for at least 6 months on a regular basis before you can diagnose dissociative identity disorder. I absolutely agree with that. Unlike a lot of people in my field, I can say with a fair degree of certainty in 40 plus years of practice that I have seen one person who's truly had DID. I'm not one of those deniers. I'm not one of the people who denies that it ever exists. But I also remember very clearly in the late 80s, early 90s, I had a very good friend. I went to graduate school. I have a lot of respect for her. She was the godmother of my daughter. And she told me that her entire practice consisted of people who had, at that time it's called MPD still, multiple personality disorder. And no, I didn't believe that. I saw some of her clients when she was on vacation. No. I'll just say they were proud MPDers. They were very proud to show me, all the number of alters they had, and it was very exciting for them to talk about that. And I just question that. At any rate, shaming mental illness. Again, there's another bad therapy joke, right? How do you treat someone with borderline personality disorder? With a referral out. That's shaming. That's very, very shaming. Okay, yeah, I already covered that, so let me move on. Becoming overly defensive about feedback or criticism. Again, this I would star or bullet this for anyone who's considering doing therapy. If you have a criticism of your therapist and your therapist comes back at you defensively, okay. Get out. Get out. That's not a therapist that you want to be working with. As I mentioned earlier, I do get criticism, and most of the time it's accurate. 90% of the time it's accurate, and I hope my general stance is to acknowledge that, accept it. If it's something that I can change or should change, to then change it. But I do not get back into the old Freudian idea of like, you're criticizing me out of resistance. You're being resistant to the therapeutic process, which really means you're being resistant to me. Trying to be your friend, all right? And this can be difficult because in cultic relationships, the boundaries tend to be loose or non-existent. And that can get acted out again in the therapeutic context. I've had people say to me like, hey, I really wish we could just go out and have a beer together. And I'm like, no, well, how about a Coke? No, nothing. We're not going out together, period. Checking the clock too much. All right, I have a clock. It's in full view of myself. It's in full view of the patient. Yep, every now and then I glance over to see how much time is left, and once in a while I'll get quote unquote caught. Hey, I saw you just glance at the clock, and my response is, yes, I want to make sure we're on time and that I'm not missing it. I did glance at the clock. The therapist is constantly buried in notes, and that, I take notes during my session. I don't take them afterwards, but they're very brief. My own little, shorthand. And I've had occasionally, and I try very hard not to do that while the client is really engaged with me. No contact outside of the session. Going past the end of the session, that's actually a problem. Therapist identifies too much with you, and that is a major problem in addictions treatment, because a lot of addictions therapists are recovering addicts themselves. And on the one hand, that can be a really good thing. On the other hand, it can also be a very limiting thing. So you're seeing a therapist who themselves have been involved in a cultic group. First of all, as we all know, the processes may be very similar, but cultic groups vary tremendously from each other. So my experience in a cultic group may have very little to do with your experience in a cultic group. So identifying too closely can be a real problem. All of that inappropriate. I'll get to that in a minute. Oops, wrong one. Okay. So here's my special warning. It's natural to be drawn to charismatic therapists. All right. I know that's happened here in ICSA. I know that's happened outside of here as well. I'm not saying don't do it. Don't resist, quote unquote, seeing therapists who've published books and been on speaking tours and done, TV stuff and blah, 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 blah. I'm just saying be aware of it. Charisma for people who have left cultic groups can be a danger, period. Can be also a very healing characteristic, but absolutely avoid therapy gurus. Credentials may be a start, but they're not the end. Personal referrals are really, I agree, they're often really the best way to go. If you know someone, if someone says, oh, that's my therapist, or that has been my therapist, or was my brother's therapist, or whatever, that's a good idea. And again, it's always safe to question, confront, or criticize your therapist. All right? And I would say go one step further. The therapist should celebrate your critical reasoning. And again, it is never right or appropriate or therapeutic or legal for a therapist to engage a client or a patient in any form of romantic or sexual relationship, period. There is that is one of the very, very few absolutes, at least for me, well, for therapists in general. So, and finally, I want to speak to this issue. Obviously, a lot of therapists, and some of you may have heard me say this earlier, a lot of therapists don't have little or no experience, or at least they believe they have little or no experience with folks who've been involved in cultic groups. I'm glad to say that that's changing, largely because we're finally beginning to realize a connection between coercive control in one-on-one relationships, how that connects to coercive control in cultic groups. So a lot of therapists, we can bridge that, because a lot of therapists, most therapists do get at least some training in abusive relationships. However, this is really important. It is not your duty to educate your therapist. It is your therapist's duty to educate themselves. You might recommend some books, you might recommend some websites, but it is not your duty, should not be on your time or on your dime to train a therapist. All right. If your therapist refused, I remember the first time I had to work with somebody who was wound up transitioning, a transgendered person. This was in 1983, and and they came in and told me what was going on, and the first thing I did was hit the library. No internet then, so I hit the library. Anyway, thank you, thank you.